Through Teams. So if you guys speak, it's also going through Teams. I'm just saying.
I'll keep quiet. Most of will speak. I'll keep quiet.
Just be aware that we are live.
I'm making a joke here, but I'm allowed to make a joke.
No.
Some of my students flagged them for AI. They complained that second year sociology they were able to use that app. And I was like, it's only one assignment.
You said it.
Second years.
No?
More.
Somebody give me a thumbs up online. Steve.
Bernard, you seem to be online.
Yeah, not physically. But if we have a sound on, is there anybody else that's online apart from me?
I'm not in the meeting.
You've got the here.
Wait, I'll let Neil in.
Neil, are you online?
No, I'll just let him in. Okay, so Neil's online.
Yes, I'm here and I can hear. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Taryn Bernard and Lloyd Hill. I'm sure you're more familiar with. We're going to be talking today about generative AI and undergraduate writing. The plan is that I talk for 20 minutes and then Lloyd talks for 20 minutes and then we're going to open the floor for questions. But Lloyd asked me to say we might not address all your questions. The idea is that we also have a sort of collaborative discussion. So this paper I presented to a version of this I presented to the South African Association for Language Teaching in July. And I've adapted a little bit for this audience, but I didn't realize, I should have known that the audience would also have students in. So some of my address is for lecturers, but I would like to also extend the invite to students to also help think about these issues. My talk is also situated in the field of linguistics and applied linguistics. So I've decided to include some of the technical stuff, because I think that might be interesting to you, but please ask questions afterwards if there was something that you didn't grasp. I'll be happy to explain it. And then also, I do read, I'm sorry, but I've learned my lesson the hard way too many times and tried to weave too many complex ideas together, and then everyone loses their way. So I am going to read a bit. I've gotten into the habit of starting my presentations by declaring that I'm not a robot, which people find quite funny. But I also am starting to feel that the joke's over a little bit, and I take the whole thing very seriously. For those who don't know this about me, I'm the coordinator of our extended curriculum program in this faculty, and I'm also responsible for equipping a group of multilingual students, most of whom are second, third, and fourth. I used I didn't correct that, speakers of English with the skills needed to comprehend and write complex academic texts in English. So historically, ECPs in historically white universities have been understood in terms of race, but as the students in these universities become more diverse, socioeconomic class is perhaps a more useful lens, although I do acknowledge that race and class are interlinked in this country especially. The point is that ECP students are typically on NSFAS funding, come from rural areas and informal settlements, and have very little access to technological tools. So that's the place that I'm coming from. The way I see it, I'm also standing in front of you today because OpenAI and other tech companies are urging me to reconsider what I do, but they're actually urging us to reconsider what we do. And in the era of AI, lecturing is at the top of the list of jobs under threat, while it's also exposing jobs that are about creating content, and academic publishing is not outside the realm of content production. And so my talk takes this form of a critical reflection of the context. It might also create some moral panic. If this is the case, please keep in mind that I am a Luddite. I played around with ChatGPT once, and I don't want to do it again because I don't want to communicate with the bot, even though the world is urging me to do so. So I'm just being upfront about my stance. And since I'm on that topic, I also wanted to mention that I have a background in critical methods of applied linguistics, which means I've been trained to critically analyze texts and discourses and to point fingers at dominant institutions and linguistic constructions of reality that perpetuate inequalities. These constructions and representations are often not self-evident, so we need a deeper analysis to uncover things that we take for granted. I became interested in academic development and literacy development in higher education context from this perspective, from the perspective that universities are powerful institutions that include and exclude people, and that language and discourses in many ways play a role in these exclusionary practices. My expertise in critical methods of applied linguistics also made me familiar with scholars in systemic functional linguistics and critical discourse analysis, the same scholars who play an influential role in new literacy studies, and the idea that academic writing is a social practice. This assertion is probably obvious to you, and it's an important one that I'm going to return to at my conclusion. But for now, I want to say that equipping a group of multilingual students, most of whom are second, third, and fourth language speakers of English, with the skills needed to comprehend complex academic texts in English, was never about teaching standard English for me. I know too much about colonial practices and ideologies of English to adopt such a superficial stance. If equipping students with these skills was just about grammatical competence and language editing, I might view large language models, artificial intelligence, and editing paraphrasing tools as a way to level the playing field. However, if they are used to bypass comprehension and other important cognitive processes, if they are used to bypass pragmatic competence, the playing field might end up more uneven than we ever imagined. I define pragmatic competence as the knowledge of the social, cultural, and discourse conventions that have to be followed in various situations. According to Highland, who's quite a key thinker in the realm of applied linguistics as it relates to academic writing, who is writing specifically about academic literacy, pragmatic competence is the ability of writers to construct a credible representation of themselves and their work, aligning themselves with socially shaped identities of their communities. Pragmatic competence is, in other words, an identity issue. Highland also writes that for those new to a particular social context, as my ECP students are, aligning oneself with the socially shaped identities of an academic community can pose a considerable challenge, as they are likely to find that the discourse and practices of their disciplines support identities that are very different to their own and those that they bring with them. These problems often place students at a rhetorical and interpersonal disadvantage. It might be easy to believe that large language models and AI can bridge the gap here, but since we are talking about coloniality and disadvantage, I can't but point to the critical literature that positions tech companies and big data collection processes as neo-colonial powers and practices. Also, pragmatic competence is an important skill in any context and in any language or any variety of language. Equipping a group of multilingual students with the skills needed to comprehend complex academic texts was always about access for me. And I mean real access, not about teaching people how to be imposters or fake it till you make it. Stellenbosch is a very real context, a social space from which many of my students' parents and their parents were excluded. Until there is complete transformation, entry into the space and full participation in the space requires not only economic and social capital, but knowledge of the discourses, and it requires a particular type of language use. It requires a particular representation of self that is acceptable here. But what self is acceptable here? Is it one that is simply just confident, authoritative, and committed to one's ideas? Is self the same as identity? And if so, is it worth doing identity work in my classroom? Is it worth spending time encouraging my students to understand complex academic texts so well that they can position themselves towards the text so they can select verbal clauses and modal verbs in a way that accurately reflects their position, their stance, their ideologies, and their lived experiences? Is it worth even considering that knowledge is embodied and to ask my students questions about how they embody academic knowledge and how they use language to signal with? Do they do so comfortably? Who is the self in the era of AI? Are AI tools as non-human intelligent actors an extension of the self? Similarly, what is voice in academic writing if the voice also belongs to a bot that is not using language in the same way we are using language? These are just some of the questions I'm asking and which I will begin to answer now. In 2012, Taryn wrote that providing an overview to the concept of voice is no simple feat. It's a term most writers have heard or used, perhaps even in their early days of writing, and that many have strong feelings about, whether positive or negative. I myself avoided it for many years, Tardy writes, leery of its imprecise meaning and its often literary and aesthetic overtones. Indeed, one of the thorniest issues with the notion of voice is the broad range of meanings ascribed to it. Metaphorical interpretations are multiple and subject to arguments about how far the metaphor can accurately be extended. In addition to this excellent point that voice is actually just metaphorical, shifts in linguistic theory have been accompanied by changes in the conceptions of voice. One shift occurred when this term, which had been used only for oral language, came to be used for written language too. For example, Elbo, who's another very famous linguist, wrote in 1973, "In your natural way of producing words, there is a sound, a texture, a rhythm, a voice, which is the main source of power in your writing. This voice is the force that will make a reader listen to you, the energy that drives the meaning." Here, Elbo is speaking of voice as something pertaining to an individual. But we now acknowledge that voice is also a social issue. Many scholars have written about how students have to develop the peculiar ways of knowing, selecting, evaluating, reporting, concluding, and arguing that define the discourse of the community. They must speak with authority, and to do this, they must use another's voice and another's code. Bakhtin, another famous linguist, speaks about heteroglossia, or the idea that texts are comprised of multiple, competing, and often conflicting voices. It is also important here, as is the research into the social nature of academic writing, which has emphasized the various kinds of collaboration that are involved in writing, not only co-authorship, but also from those whom Rita and Vibon call trusted advisors, which could be a lecturer or tutor or someone from the writing center or even an editor. We then have to consider the changes that translators make when they transform a text for another linguistic community. Is it still warranted to talk about writer's voice and identity as if it belongs to one person? Now that trusted advisors and tutors and editors and translators are bots, do we still want to talk about voice? We also have Ivanik's popular proposal to consider that voice not only refers to the multiplicity of voices associated with writing, such as the manifestation of writers' discursive and relational identities. For Ivanek, there are three aspects of identity interacting in writing, which she calls the autobiographical self, which is influenced by the writer's life history, the discoursal self, which is the image of voice the writer projects into the text, and the authoral self, which is manifested in the extent to which a writer intrudes into a text and claims responsibility for its content. This is a very famous model in applied linguistic theory when it comes to understanding identity in academic writing. What happens to the notion of voice and to identity when a text has been co-authored or authored with a bot? What happens to the autobiographical self, the authoral self, and the discoursal self? What happens to the self who has the voice? There are many ways of thinking about this, and I don't have a definitive answer, but I think it is important that we do think about it. Some have understood ChatGPT and other chatbots as a form of co-authorship. Others have warned against anthropomorphizing non-human intelligent actors because, as I said, they don't use language in the same way we do. Are AI tools then to be understood as an extension or augmentation of humans? Lloyd and Feinstein argue that AI is creating a new form of identity, a hybrid identity that merges human and technological factors, leading to a self that others have called post-human or transhuman. However, there are other ways of viewing this. The use of AI in academic writing, particularly when it is used as a content and language generation tool, voice and identity lose their reference. There is no singular person, thing, or self to which the voice in the text refers to. Rather, the style and linguistic devices of previous authors has simply just been copied. For many people, this is not an issue, ethical or otherwise. There is a mountain of literature available that documents a range of rhetorical and linguistic resources to allow second language writers to take up positions and express judgments regardless of whether this is really their position. This is the sort of fake it until you make it, I think I spoke about earlier. There are style guides. And here the article on style guides by these authors is quite pertinent. I've lost my identity. Oh, there it is in a style manual. However, if we take the point seriously that in the time of AI, voice, identity, and identity lose their reference in academic writing, or put differently, in the type of AI, the linguistic features meant to signal identity and voice lose their reference to an actual person. Much academic writing is at risk of what Jan Baudrillard called a simulation, which can be defined as the imitation of a real-world process over time. Baudrillard, in the procession of simulacra, defines this term as follows. Simulation is no longer that of a territory, a referential being or substance. It is the generation by models of a real without origin or reality, a hyperreal. It is no longer a question of imitation, nor duplication, nor even parody. It is a question of substituting the signs of the real for the real. Baudrillard's concept of hyperreality also describes the process whereby reality and representation become indistinguishable. The realization urges us to take into consideration some of the seminal texts on identity and academic writing. So how now, in the time of AI, are we to interpret Highland's statements on the slide, for example, that academic writing, like all forms of communication, is an act of identity? It not only conveys disciplinary content, but also carries a representation of the writer. Our discursive choices aligns us with certain values and beliefs that support these particular identities. The other question that I have is, what are we to do with Ivanek's model in the time of AI? In conclusion, it's important to remember that academic writing, like any other form of literacy, is a social practice, and the social practice has changed and will change over time. It is true that academic writing is not an individual process, that it doesn't take place in fixed locations at the university. Rather, it takes place everywhere, in a taxi en route to Stellenbosch, in beds, in coffee shops. Academic writing is messy. ECP students, for example, typically work from a mobile phone and draw on a set of resources that change as the technological tools change, and then they translate from their first languages back to English and back again. Academic writing is messy. The important thing for me is that students are still engaging in this messy process. I believe it's still important to focus on fostering a deep understanding of academic texts in a way that enables students to take up an authentic position towards the content and the position of the writers. I believe it is important for students to have a voice, even when writing academic texts, and to develop students' ability to weave voices together in a way that does not entail the loss of their own. Otherwise, what are we doing here? And that is my last question. Okay,
Okay, so it's partly in the nature of the situation we find ourselves in, partly on account of my own sort of insecurity around telling you too much about how I'm adapting to the situation, that I find myself spending more time talking about a particular problem and the context of the problem than actually detailing how I'm sort of dealing with it in a particular module. I must just acknowledge Linux, and I work closely on the 242 module. I'm going to give you a brief snippet of some of my first thoughts, emerging thoughts about how to practically deal with the problem that I'm trying to sketch out here. I want to begin with a few general thoughts on writing, and here my next slide sort of dovetails with what you just said. The first point is, I think this is maybe self-evident to a lot of us, but it's not self-evident to a lot of people more generally, particularly outside the linguistics and the sort of more critical social sciences. Is that writing is a form of thinking. Yeah? I don't think that's too hyperbolic. I've got an interesting quote here about Mintz. Writing is not simply a matter of expressing pre-existing thoughts clearly. It's a process through which ideas are produced and refined. And one way to think about this is in terms of the sui generis history of writing. For those of you who have a kind of linguistics background, I'm drawing on the work of Roy Harris here in particular. The broad distinction between glottic writing, okay, writing that doesn't necessarily represent speech, but that has a historical association with speech in various ways. And the various forms of non-glottic writing, examples of mathematical code, document code, musical script, stuff like that. And there is a sense in which generative AI, the technology that we've seen emerge over the course of the last roughly two decades, is a moment in the history of writing, I think. But I'm also trying to sort of present a sort of a critical take on what that means for the academy. To do that, this is where I dovetail, somewhat with the previous presentation, is to think about academic writing as a form of written voice, okay? And this notion of authorial states. Students writing in higher education are not only writing about particular areas of knowledge, they're also learning to write themselves into existing areas of knowledge, which involve particular ways of approaching knowledge making, and the sense they are learning to be, this identity that Taryn was talking about, particular types of knowledge makers, the writer, the scientist, the psychologist, the philosopher, and the sociologist in my case. So this is my kind of thumbnail sketch of the problem that we're facing. Generative AI is kind of transcended the traditional automated writing. Specifically, we're dealing with a situation where machine goes beyond sort of typical sort of grammar and spelling kind of assistance to the generation of content and the adaptation of discourse and generation of discourse into certain argumentative styles. Based on input. Yeah, input is the data is the question. So the questions that I associate with the problem are how, to what extent can we retain undergraduate writing? Partly what I'm responding to here is this kind of what I see as a bit of a knee-jerk reaction. The essays there. Maybe it is, but I don't want to believe that. So I'm kind of reacting to that. Should we still be use writing to develop coherence? That's partly what Taryn is asking. And critically, I think the one I'm really going to respond to is this idea that generative AI should be treated as a writing tool. I want to toy with this idea of writing tool, and in the very first presentation, Simon prompted a whole discussion about agency AI, agency obviously. I don't want to get too much debate about transhumanism, that's not my purpose here, but this is the key question. Okay, where is the agent in this kind of new context of writing? So this is my very simplistic summarization of the debate as I see it. Okay, the debate on what I call the use continuum. Okay. So the media response, and we saw quite a bit of this last year when ChatGPT first became kind of publicly recognized. Was ban, restrict, okay, scrap, rewrite. Manifested most obviously the shift to exams, the argument that maybe we should shift to oral, we can't really take it seriously at undergraduate level in Sociology 1 with 1,000 students. And various other alternatives that typically involves moving away from undergraduate writing. Lennox developed this very alluring analogy of grapple and embrace. Okay, we are all in a sense grappling and embracing simultaneously the new tools that are out there. And I as a work with Lennox, I don't agree with this. I just don't entirely know what it means, and that's entirely what I'm trying to develop here. But what I'm also reacting to on the other end of the spectrum, which in some ways is also quite pernicious, is this idea, what I call a critical embrace of the tool. The idea that generative AI is just a new tool. And there's a certain obvious sense in which it is a tool, and it ushers in a new kind of landscape of tools, and this is what I call the use of technological tools to unpack. But I think if we look at the macro context, okay, which should be partly done, it's rather obvious to me that it's not something good. Okay, and that we are sort of rebuilding institutions as we speak. And in some ways, maybe even the universities at stake. It's not really the upshot of what I'm talking about now, the question in the back of my mind. So, new suites of tools. Let me give an example as I was generating this PowerPoint. Right, there you go. Install ChatGPT into Excel. You get this little thing there. You plug in your title of your slide, and voila, it generates a text as well. Obviously, I didn't even read the text. I had my brief idea sort of thing. It's there, right? So, if I'm sort of playing around with it, sure, that's my season is playing around. It's not as if there aren't a whole host of new tools that are going to be coming available in the next 10 years. I think one of the important problems here is the necessity to be thinking past ChatGPT. Okay, to think beyond the kind of the embedded kind of dominance of any particular interface. ChatGPT is not even really a platform, right? I would say I use Nick Schnisik's sort of conceptualization of platforms as I get to now. The real platform is some sort of combination of the organizations that are behind it, but OpenAI, but by Microsoft, for example. It's thinking about the new sort of context in which these will be unrolled. So, very interesting. a lot of hype in AI at the moment. You may or may not have noticed that in the last 2-3 days, leading AI researchers generated two Nobel Prizes. Okay. In physics for machine learning, more generally, the underpinnings of machine learning to John Hopfield and Jeffrey Hinton, the godfather of machine learning. Okay. And in chemistry, okay, for protein structure prediction, Baker, Hasibis, and Janssen. Just to highlight Jeffrey Hinton and Dennis Hasibis, of course, Hasibis is the CEO of DeepMind. Arguably the two most influential people in AI, I would argue, on today. And what I want to say, the reason why I give you this slide is to kind of preface for the macro level discussion. You say that I sincerely hope that the economic prize doesn't also go to AI, because well, we have no problem, okay? And I'm coming at more from a kind of political economist type of perspective. And this is why I'm very critical of this notion of AI tool. Of course, we are dealing with a new macro extractive context. Okay? If I would summarize that context very briefly, it's a post-2006 success of machine learning. Right? Machine learning, the ideas associated with deep neural nets and machine learning has been around since 50s. Right? So only in 2006 they really took off. And why was that? Okay, three major reasons: new neural net algorithms, okay, software, new hardware, okay, notably GPUs and the rollout of Web 2.0 internet. But crucially, and I think this is most significant for us as social science, okay, is data, extracting data. Okay, and not all, generative AI is extractive AI. Not all AI is generative AI. Okay, but generative AI is very extractive AI. So what we see here is certain availability of data, and in addition to Web 2.0, so Web 2, which Srinix calls platform capitalism. Okay, and language data, or rather text data, is a very specific subset of this data. So I threw this little example from the process. It kind of gives you an example of the difficulties that these systems have with moving between different forms of broad context of data. Specifically, moving more generally between the visual and so the two main successful use cases of AI in the last 20 years have been computer vision, images for vision, and natural language processing. Okay. Natural language processing, in a sense, is also being more writing. Okay, the social significance has been more writing than oral. And the power of these models more has to do with what Angela in the first presentation for writing. Feeding, so feeding writing, feeding various forms of data, but particularly I think feeding writing through the dominant or frontier models. Okay, so there are dozens of large language models, but there are only 4, 5, or 6 major frontier models in the world at the moment. ChatGPT is one of them. Okay, and significantly they move from online repositories of content text, okay, increasingly to offline repositories. Those would be things like Media Corp and Allianz, Associated Press, and looking for all these, and our journals, right? The journal publishers now. They're looking for all this new data, all this debate about what to do. If they go, sort of, if we run out of human data, and then of course very significantly, computer code repositories. For example, which is a very important source of non-robotic writing. So, to think about this, I'm drawing on the work of Bernopson, who's an influential sort of tech theorist. Think about the distributive effects of AI and what he calls the Turing trap. Okay. If human-like AI leads machines to automate rather than augment human data, it creates the risk of concentrating wealth and power. And with that concentration comes the peril of being trapped in an equilibrium in which those without power have no ways to improve the outcome. The situation I call the Turing trap. This is kind of an updated version of Keynes' notion of technological unemployment, I think, in a sense. A new term for the digital age, in a sense. But I think it's useful, and I want to think across this kind of distinction between automation and augmentation, and apply it specifically to language. This is something that I've generated just as a prompt discussion, about how to think about the emerging impact of reading and writing, specifically in our sort of university context, but maybe more generally as well. Okay, and so it's not to be too sort of binary about it. I should acknowledge that there is kind of a grey area between augmentation and automation, and many of the technologies we're using now, we don't really know whether to what extent they are augmenting or automating. I think it's a useful distinction to think about, and I also think it's possibly a useful distinction to present to our students. Okay, to think about what they're doing. Okay, when they use them, because they're going to use them. Okay, I don't want to ban it. Okay, one of the basic principles of my model is I don't ban it. Okay, but are there possibilities for new practice? Okay, that can be leveraged against the risks of these things. Okay, which is very, very real. Okay, this example I give specifically with respect to writing. Okay, if a student plans and crafts the text before testing the composition for grammar, okay, that's better than just and then my students do say, "Oh, I got the bot to sort of outline my essay." Why? Why would you do that? And then on the writing side of it, a student simply uses the LLM to generate text. Okay, produce what is essentially a plagiarism-like practice, which will prove to be very difficult from our perspective to treat as plagiarism. Okay, that's another issue. Okay, yeah. So this is a kind of a model that I throw out to you. Maybe it's useful, maybe it's not, but that's what I'm thinking about at the moment. And then very briefly, my situated response. Okay, in this particular module that I've developed, part of the reason why I'm uncertain, I didn't teach this year, and it's such a moving target, and it's taught in my stead. But I think we share kind of a broad commitment to exploring the tools and the context in which they're used. And also, this idea of creating a module context of personal reflection on the risks and rewards of using these new techniques. More specific ideas that underpin my module. Again, I don't go back to the exam, at least not in the classical sense of rote rehearsal. I'm adapting my commitment to authorial, committed to retaining sort of authorial writing, but I have similar kind of reservations about what this really means in this context. And I'm toying with this distinction between what I call open writing, okay, where the essay topic is prescribed for general production, uncontrolled use of AI. And controlled writing, which is basically Gemach, forcing students to come and sit in a controlled unit. And I think possibly we're going to need to use both. But to the extent that we feel obliged to use controlled writing, in a sense that, we need to really think about how we handle that, because obviously it is reasserting a certain kind of exam control over the teaching space. So my inclination would be to go for short interpreted essay with lots of time. Okay, to minimize kind of the typical exam anxiety that you will in any way. And to make an open book. Okay, to really encourage students to read and not to get away from rote rehearsal. Bring their written text. And it's not the handwriting that's the problem there, or the generation and uncritical use of the text. So at a very general level, these are some of the ideas that I'm putting in my mind. A kind of a situated response to it. Wider. All right, thank you. Yeah, we're going to throw it open as we say. The idea is to facilitate a wider discussion. Now, if you ask me a specific question, I will take it, but I'm not going to feel obliged to answer every question, but we want to sort of generate a range of points of discussion.
Thanks. First of all, a word of thanks. This was very useful, and both presentations really sort of provided much food for thought. I really appreciate the effort that has gone into hosting them. And my question is really, would it be possible for you to make your slides available, just because some of the quotations, not to steal them, but to cite them properly. Some of the quotations I just found incredibly evocative, and it would be so useful to bring them into the classroom. This idea of self and identity and voice. I don't know, but if you don't feel like doing that, that's fine.
I'm
happy to.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I'm quite happy with it. We'll make a plan to.
Thank you.
Cool.
Brilliant.
Okay, so I've got a thought for both of you. So I like both of your presentations very much. So for Taryn, I think the question of authorship, I wonder if, starting from the point of view, not that everybody's an author, or all students can be authors or so on, but maybe from the point that authorship is something that's achieved through a very long process, and that maybe this, OpenAI, etc., large language models pushes the bar of authorship even further along, that it's much harder, in fact, to become an author. And that relates to what I want to say to Lloyd, because I liked your presentation, but I'm a bit, when you say that you're more open to students sort of using these tools in composition. Well, composition itself is a skill. There's a de-skilling. If you can't summarize, if you can't go to a text and figure out what the key ideas are, if you're feeding that in and getting one of these programs to spit out what the key ideas are, and then using another one to arrange them, and then sort of putting your stamp on it, your authorship's gone long ago. But I wonder, again, thinking about authorship as an achievement is something that few of us or few academics even, we strive for it, but maybe we don't always achieve it, rather than maybe a kind of more contemporary idea. We're all authors, we all have opinions. Well, maybe actually, they're so mediated by these systems that, in fact, we're not authors, and authorship actually becomes a goal. And what that means for pedagogy is challenging, and I think that both of you have engaged that. But certainly after now trying at first year for more uncontrolled assessment again, I'm convinced that at least at first year we have to have controlled writing, not abandon essays, but really controlled writing texts, and no internet when they're writing.
I get the sense a lot of the departments are actually going that route. Yeah. Controlled shorter assessments where students can bring the readings to the venue.
Or some summary. I think in your class they can bring a page of notes as well, right?
Not a page of notes. I mean, I'm experimenting with two things in first year and second year. I mean, Generative AI now we're doing control test for first years, but for second year, I mean, it depends. I think the conversation of when I assess, really, I think the conversation then comes back. What are we assessing now? What are we trying to do in that process of it? If you're assessing, of course, the writing skills and summarizing, then the question is, AI can do that now. What is the use of it when there is actually a machine to summarize a text for you? Then there's another question around what are we reading? Because there's so many texts that is also not available on AI that actually forces us as academics to start thinking, what are we teaching, what material, and what are we assessing? And for me, I think what I'm trying to, with first year, what we're trying to do is to think around, okay, they can summarize the whole thing, but we're trying to teach the student what are the tools, what are the central arguments, and, and also the context where the author is trying to read through that process. Where are the authors trying to do so that when they read, whether it's AI or whatever material they read, it's not reading for summary. It's reading actually to understand what the author is trying to do and what does it actually do for you. For second year, what we're experimenting, or what I'm trying to experiment with, is trying to think, with every text that I give to students, what are the ideological underpinning of that author? And how does that ideological underpinning frame an argument? And it's up to you then to understand then how that framing can emphasize and heighten a certain point, but not necessarily. And how do you actually start thinking around those questions? I mean, I gave them a podcast on AI, on Uber and so on, about algorithms and labor and so on, to think around ideology, but also to think around how that hides or heightens certain arguments, and how do they apply it to like a podcast now, And these are questions around discipline, and also that inherently discipline is ideological as well in various ways. But what are you trying to assess with a student at this point with all these machines? And I think that's where, for me, the questions become more pertinent than ever before. And then what text are we referring to? Do we actually still have to read certain text? And in what form do we read them?
Thank you. Also, I want to take a few more.
Yeah, thank you very much. What's worrying to me is the status with which students regard the AI, in the sense that they see it as authoritative in some ways, appears to them because it can sort of reproduce the authoritative sounding text. They see it as authoritative, and so that they will decide, for instance, that how the AI defines a text is the correct way versus how I have told them to. It's a strange way in which all of a sudden I am the lecturer here, not the AI. But they seem impervious to me telling them. So there's a way in which it has a kind of authority because they don't really understand how it works.
A lot of students do not understand what they're actually using.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think this has to somehow be communicated. My students actually ask, please, can you explain to us how it works? Because it also makes stuff up. It lies. It's very unreliable.
We have a technical term for that. Hallucination. Any more? I'm not getting off the hook, but I'm going to respond to your thing. But we want to just sort of.
Maybe just to add, I think relates to the point Bill was making before. I mean, it's a question of assessment, but there's in fact the entire conversation. I'm noticing students, of course, rely a lot nowadays on devices to access text. So it's no longer, people don't print stuff off the time. So people are sitting on their phones, they're sitting on computers. And so even questions asked in class, not remarked, just a discussion. You will sometimes get, well, the other day I had a student who was reading me something on his phone. And I said, well, it's a very composed answer. He said, well, we sat together and composed. And we spoke a bit more, I asked him a bit more, and then at some stage he said, well, they say that. And then at that moment you would just see he froze and everyone realized, you just typed in the question. So it's way before you get into the writing. But it's just in the very conversation, it's already sitting there.
I'm just horrified by the whole thing. I am on the side of trying as hard as we can to ban it and have serious consequences for using it or any sign that it's been used. I'm actually at that point. I know there was not everyone agrees with me, or of course that's not possible. But I also just want to say, for those of you that don't know, there's, we just are going through faculty board is the student guidelines for academic integrity, where this sort of behavior is treated like plagiarism, and there will be consequences, not just the little conversation between you and the lecturer. But I heard about a seminar this week with NMU, where there's actually a centralized committee that processes all essays where students have used AI. And the central committee looks at this, decides whether the student has used it or what the consequences are. And I mean, the first consequence is watching a video that explains these things. And then 2 more serious consequences. So I just wanted to mention that as well. I'm not really budging on my stance that this is very problematic. I think that no matter what way you look at it, I think students are missing the opportunity to develop some really important cognitive skills. And I had a student in my office this morning who said, I know he doesn't use it, but his marks are not so good then. And he's saying it's frustrating because the students using it are getting better marks, and it's about the mark. And I think that's also the problem. It's not about the marks, or it shouldn't be about the marks. It should also be about knowledge acquisition.
I mean, the reason I reacted to you immediately was that, of course, I mean, I had 30 of these cases out of 1,000 in my office this week and in first years. But I'm also aware with a kind of teenager how difficult it is to get into a university like Stellenbosch, and how for so many students it is about the marks. And so that it's, I mean, I completely identify with you about kind of authorship and about the integrity of the process and the learning process. But these students have already been through a kind of matric system in which it's very hard to get into a university like that, and marks are decisive for funding, for places. So they're kind of socialized in such a deep way that if you see another student using this tool, and then some people are sort of like, well, let's experiment with it, and those students are doing better. It's sort of, I don't know. It's unsurprising to me that students would say that to you.
I have a question. So I've heard the last couple of weeks we've been speaking a lot about AI and all the ways that it's bad and all of that. But it's not something that's going to go away. So it's going to be here. It's going to improve. What is then the way forward? Because we can't keep saying, oh, we're going to ban children. It's going to get better, which means it's going to be more difficult to figure out when they're using AI. And students are also figuring out ways to use it even smarter. So what is the way forward for, the arts and creative writing? Because it just seems like a problem with no solution.
Yes. That is correct.
Interpretive dance.
Apologies for.
Sorry, I don't mean to poke fun, but I think that's exactly the issue. It's such a complex problem, and I don't think anyone, unfortunately, really knows what the solution is or what we should do, because the other argument is that students are going to be using these tools in the workplace. Yeah, I'll get back to that before.
Okay. I'm going to answer your question, because I think your question is in a way tied to how I'm going to respond to Bernard. And Bernard, as I said, I'm grappling with the modalities in my module, to what extent I'm going to be open and to what extent I'm going to be closed. But ideologically, I'm quite committed to open as one, and it's partly got to do with this reason. At least some percentage. I don't know what percentage, maybe 5%, 10% or something. Partly it gives me a kind of a sense of looking at the same student on an open written piece and a closed written piece, and sort of giving a sense. And partly maybe it's a little bit of hubris on my part, because unlike Taryn, okay, I am somebody who plays with this a lot. Okay, I'm a bit of a technophile. I'm surrounded by technophiles, so I think I include Lennox as one of my eminent technophiles here, because he knows more than me. So I played with this. I enjoy playing with this space, and I think we've got to be frank about this as well. There's a bit of a generation gap. Okay, is that I'm probably less difficult for my generation, whereas your generation is, this is what you live, sleep, breathe. The technology. I don't want to use the digital native. It's very loaded. I don't like that term, but there is a sense in which younger generations are more native than most people of my generation. So I also have the advantage of teaching a module which is very much I'm trying to follow this stuff, which most people are not. Okay, so let me speak from that. Let me speak to what I see as kind of emerging tensions in changing AI. And we can start with the Nobel Prize awards. Okay. Now I read just this morning's a comment saying that what we see here is actually two very, very different approaches to AI. Okay. This Jeffrey Hinton is so-called godfather of AI. Lots of people following in that wake, the sort of ChatGPT. This is pure generative AI. This is basically flooded with lots of data. It's basically empiricist, as much data as you want. The fundamental kind of ideological belief is these things will get better if we just provide more data. Kind of fundamentally sort of empiricist kind of assumption underpinning this type of thing. Okay, and one of the implications of this kind of model is hallucination. These things, and maybe I'm wrong, but I have my suspicion that is going to be a fundamental problem going forward. Okay, that this type of generative AI is going to hit. Okay, I may be wrong. Okay, but that's what I see. So, and I think if students use it, part of my hubris is I have a certain way of setting essays and that is that I believe that I can sort of detect this within the kind of the game that I set up in my assignment topics. I can sort of see when a student is not doing my reading. Create a kind of a closed ecosystem for reading in my module. I do things like say you have to cite each article in my reading space twice, okay? Because the bot doesn't cite, okay? The bot it tries, but that's often where the sort of worst type of hallucination comes. So it's not create all these information sources. Sort of thing. Maybe I'm going to get sort of overtaken in it. Okay, but I know that the emerging debate here is a debate on what you might call sort of pure deep learning, where you just feed data, no kind of underlying structure, and what's increasingly referred to as neurosymbolic AI. Okay? In the sense, data assembly is the master of neurosymbolic AI. This chemistry award went for protein structure went to something called AlphaFold. Okay, AlphaFold 2. Those of you know anything about data science, I think there used to be the youngest junior in the world, secondary to Judith Polgar, the strongest female chess player in the world, at one stage. He also developed the forerunner of this topic program that is now predicting all these proteins in chemistry, with two basically game-playing programs, AlphaGo and AlphaZero, which defeated the top traditional chess. So this is not generative AI. Okay, this is a kind of neurosymbolic AI, and it's built on the kind of recognition, more of a recognition that actually these things don't think. Generative AI does not think like us. Okay, we need to build more of our kind of rules, our kind of structures into AI if they're going to be in the useful. And it seems to be showing more results. This is kind of results-centered AI. This is pie in the sky underlying technology. I think sort of thing. I was pie in the sky, being that maybe maybe that's unfair, but I'm saying this is what's underpinning what we're seeing in the large language models now. And yeah, I think it's going to. I think there are things we can do, but we have to sort of try and change for the times and try and. I just feel committed to creating a space in the module, where you say to students, yes, look, I'm going to let you do this, but if you cheat, I can control to some extent internally, but maybe I'll stop doing that. Maybe I'll stop doing it, but that's kind of what I think.
I mean, like now ChatGPT is like at 4.0 now. And apparently the capacity of it's like at the level where they can write in a PhD. But what are the opportunities for social science and for natural science? Because these are different things, because it's doing two, in terms of like, I think the crisis in natural science in terms of the formula of the whole process, it creates a different problem from the social science. And I think we also have to think around those two things because they're very different. And I think for anybody to think around that. But also there's like a question on the social science of like, there's an opportunity here because it forces us to return back to the people, like literally do field work in a different way and start thinking around knowledge production in a very different way from just only like text in a simplistic way. And how do we then incorporate our assessment, our teaching tools that returns to what we are originally, especially the social science, like I'm speaking from being a sociologist and so on, that created an opportunity to rethink, like from first year to second year, again, assessment, what are we trying to build rather than text in an ordinary way? And you can't, of course, you can do like transcripts and so on now. And I think we should encourage our students to now use, when you do transcript, like the easiest way to do it is software. It's like actually AI. It can do that now in terms of all these things. But also, how do we build in an honors, whatever, like the science? And we can draw sometimes from the natural science, because what the natural science has done is to do also practical, you know, like they do practical work in a different way. And we actually have to start thinking around these questions. Of course, they have different problems in natural science that is very different from us in terms of the social science. But these are conversations, I think, that we have to start building into the process of it in terms of how we teach the modules and what way that gives us an opportunity to go back to the source of our skills already.
I agree with you, and I think those skills are important.
Yes.
And actually, that's a conversation that's been happening in the faculty. You know, during COVID, everything went online.
Yeah.
And now this is forcing us back into the classroom and to also reconsider what we think about teaching and learning.
Yes.
Yeah.
Next, I also just sorry before Leonard speaks. This is our fourth and final seminar in the series, and I've been bad in the past, making a point of going to people online. So please put your hand up or just come in after Leonard speaks. Anyone online means, we haven't got many people online speaking.
I want to latch on. I mean, I really think it's very important that we realize the de-skilling that's going to happen because if we allow AI use, definitely. And I think that's really.
Is a bat coming?
No, but there's no bat. The bat is, there is a bat, but it's not what you think.
Okay.
The bat is, how do we do this? It takes so long to learn, so much practice to learn this skill properly. And if we don't have take-home essays, how? That's the question. That's the bat. It's not agreeing or disagreeing whether it's better or not better. It's a practical logistics issue.
I agree.
And one of the suggestions I always say is we need computer rooms where you can have your lecture in a computer room with lockdown environments where we can make them sit and write. And they can't access. We can control the writing, right? That's one, but that's not necessarily logistics possible. Do you get where I'm going with this? I'm not saying I'm disagreeing with the fact that it's really important for them to learn to write without the bot. I think I'm asking how do we continue to do this? What are we going to do? And then when they do get, is there a phase where it becomes okay, then to allow the bots to maybe push what they've learned into a next level? Because that's happening with lecturers and with academics. One stage where you've learned the skill, then the bot could become a really useful thing to assist you to go further than you would have ever gone without it, without cheating, making the bot write for you.
Befriending the bot.
Where is it? So those questions are not answered yet.
Yeah.
And we need to focus on answering those questions rather than saying, I'm against it or I'm for
I
it.
agree with you there. And that
I don't think it's a choice.
I agree.
Yeah.
We don't really have that choice.
Yeah.
That's my point.
So you mean a whole rethink around academic literacy in the faculty?
Like this is what we're trying to do with the 242 is, and we do a lot within this module. I'm glad she entered. We're trying really hard to redesign the assessment process at least, and how we engage with the students and how we teach them to engage and understand the bot and the risks of the bot and the de-skilling aspect. But they're not even all there, And the ones who are not there are the ones. That's what I like. Oh, that's what I like about this the seminar we had, where they use this in UJO in Northwest.
That's how I understood.
So if they get a high AI score, I don't agree with the system perfectly, but there's a good thing in there. If they get a high AI score, they get flagged. You type in their name, they go to, it gets submitted. They go to see a group. then they're forced to watch this video that teaches them about the disadvantages of using a bot. If they do it again, and we're talking 5,000 a year people doing this, and then they do it again, then they get a 0 this time for the essay, but then they have to go for a 2-week course where they teach them about academic integrity and the misuse of bots, and this is what they're doing there. I don't know, I think that's the answer, but what they're doing, they're creating a database, and they're creating the people who are struggling and who are using the bots to be forced to go through some sort of educational process around the bot and its use. That's interesting.
I like that idea. I can see Lana's not a fan.
No, sure, but
Creating a whole administration to deal with a bunch of people not behaving. Where's the resources for it? We're talking about, extremely resource hungry new system that we're now catering for.
By the way, we haven't spoken about the environmental cost of every time that something is generated by it. But I mean, I think Ilana and I were talking this morning, and it reminded me of something that a colleague of mine, old friend of mine, Stephen Sparks, was doing at UJ. And I mean, his point was reading. How is this related to reading? How are people reading? I mean, because a lot of this is not just a shortcut to writing; it's also a shortcut to reading. And one of the challenges that we face. I mean, I get what Morsa is saying, and I think doing more sociologies that are practice-based can assist. But there's also a fundamental thing from first year. Whatever you're reading, whether it's in the canon, out of the canon, new canon, whatever, just getting students to sit and read. All the English people, I think, all the English professors have gone, but I wondered if in English even, like whether how many novels the students are reading. I mean, is there a decline there too? And how it is that we can design a teaching that's not, I mean, it doesn't start with the punitive. It doesn't start with what are the mechanisms to police it. But what the problem is reading. How do we design a more effective pedagogical model to help with reading, and then think about assessments that connect to that, whether those are, controlled in a computer room, whether they're pen and paper. Surely they have to get shorter. Surely we have to think about ways to scaffold that go from first, second, third year. Maybe honors becomes, or third year, depending on the department, becomes the time to do take-home stuff, and you can't do it at first and second year, because the other problem that I was wondering, pushing against Lloyd's self-declared hubris is, I for all the joys of being chair, I've had to compile the numbers and the pass rates of all of our modules over the last 2 years. And how do you do this at scale? You're looking at 2.5. Your module, what is it? 242, 397 in 2022, 548 in 2023. This is the big. You're not reading 580 essays. That's the truth. So even if we take your hubris, even if we take your knowledge of your inbuilt detector seriously, you're not reading one of the 580 essays.
And I think teaching shouldn't be. And I mean, unless you're going to reduce people to being AI inspectors. I mean, as a teaching tool, you know what I mean? And I think also we had to think around that as well. Like, we're becoming, part of my skills now is to become these, you know what I mean, worried about, instead of teaching what is required, and worried about whether a student has, an AI, how many, is it true, is it not? It's you know what I mean? And I think those are some of the issues that
use the words for no.
My God. I mean, I can't think of anything worse. But the issue is that around reading, but also knowing the students also, we're getting students who are actually from high school already. The attention span is limited. And how do we deal with also those questions as well? It's not easy, you know what I mean? And these are big questions that needs an ecosystem that can enable to think about teaching very differently.
I mean, the cynical response to, policing or whatever else, some friends at other universities that I won't mention are now AI marking, so if we get to this point where you're so cynical about, AI is good for you, blah, blah, then now we have AI marking. There are programs to help you do that. So on the other side, we could just go, bugger it. If this is a system we're swimming in, why are we slogging away as lecturers and tutors and whatnot?
But this came up in my conversation with the chair of the HDRT, they're now dealing with postgraduate students who have used AI in their theses, but it turns out the problem also needs to be addressed among supervisors who are using AI to generate reports.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to respond.
We should lock them all up.
I want to respond specifically to Mosa and David. I mean, it's an important point. But before I do, I want to go back online. Anybody online? No names mentioned. Rhodes University. Anybody online wants to come in and say something? Please, just come in.
Currently known as.
Don't put your hand up. Just speak now. Hold your peace.
Okay.
Rhodes University.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. I mean, I think we've been also, like everybody else, trying to figure out what do we do with this AI thing. We had a whole roadshow going to all faculties and all of that. And I mean, at the end of our conversation, we've taken a differential approach. So obviously, each discipline has their own idea of what is knowledge and what are the skills that you need to walk away with. So our approach has been to figure out what are the key things to hone in on, and then to see how do we set up assessment to be differentiated. So we try and do different things. So we'll do some reading tests for some. We'll do some little writing stuff in a tutorial. We'll do take-home stuff. We will do everything else. But one thing that we put in from the get-go is, and this is not across the whole institution, is to bring in AI literacies. So all the things that students don't know about AI. The biggest success we've had is actually doing a research project with first, second, third, and fourth years in economics, where I built a GPT that would help us with a systematic review. And we ran an entire journal through it. And students could have a look at what it does and the errors it makes. The moment we did that in that module, those students actually started using it less, or at least in different ways. And also the one last thing that we are also trying to think about is, what does this mean for skills going into the future? Because Lloyd, I agree with you. I think writing as we know it is going to change. And one concept that we decided to hang our hat on for now is called evaluative judgment. So part of our assessment is evaluative judgment, i.e. let's use the AI for something in our discipline, be it a summary, be it a critique, be it one we've got somebody that's using it as a tutor bot. So we try in different ways to incorporate it. But I mean, the biggest challenge is it is going to be experimental to a very large extent. And I think that's the big one to get our heads around, because we're all trying to solve the problem now. But I think our thinking is, what does your discipline look like in 2030? Should be the question we need to think about. So yeah, I mean, but yeah, thanks. It was really an awesome talk so far.
Thank you, Neil. It's great.
Nice to have you back.
Getting another university perspective on that. And Neil, for those of you guys that was quite influential here and is now very involved on the roadside with this type of thing. I'm thinking about Neil, what you said, thinking about discipline sort of 30 years in the future. I think, yeah, this is not evident, but this is one of the things that really sits behind this chart for me, is it's not just about thinking about sort of flat practical responsibilities at undergraduate level. That there is a kind of an epistemological stake here, and that stake is that this is going to affect some disciplines more than others. Okay, there's a kind of existential moment for some disciplines. I think particularly disciplines that sort of style themselves simply on summarizing and doing the sort of things bots do. You know, it's not about summarizing. I agree with you. A lot of lecturers in the humanities have this sort of modus operandi of just getting students to summarize reading. Okay, that pedagogy is gone. Okay, but that's one of the good things. What we need more of, I think, you know, and I agree. I mean, Stephen Sparks' article is excellent. For those of you who haven't read it, go look at it on the Mail and Guardian website. He really makes a good point for reading. Okay. Yeah. What does it mean? But what does it mean? I mean, what does it mean in terms of not just reading as a practice, but reading as a kind of epistemological or more kind of ontological issue in particular disciplines? Canons. I mean, you're a canon person. Okay? Is it always, you know, key sociologist now more than sort of Marx Weber kind of thing? These are the sort of debates that are going to be existential, I think, for some disciplines, and it's really about you know, thinking about reading as positioning to maintain some kind of positional voice, okay, within a particular disciplinary space, which partly I'm trying to do through open writing as well. Open writing with a certain vision of reading, which I haven't gone into much today. Any more? We still have time, people.
So a last comment. Yeah. We must just know that it's shifted. The bots don't just write now from their training data. There are several free bots available now that you upload the PDF.
Yeah.
And it will answer questions and interpret and give you questions and arguments. It's getting very sophisticated and very good at it. Anything you upload in terms of PDF, it then focuses and only uses those. So you can give them 30 readings. They can actually upload all 30 and ask it questions across those 30. You can ask it to identify the most relevant ones that we've been doing. Now it's possible to get a bot to do that. So they don't have to read at all anymore. We're going to have to make them sit down in the reading class.
Absolutely.
And that's what
Spark says.
I'm serious. I think the bots are going, it's ahead of the game all the time, slightly. Not for all the students, because not all of them do it, use it. But for the ones who want to, I'm talking about maybe 10% of the class right now, or even more, are just going for the next available bot.
No, this
it's a big problem. We can talk about that later.
But also, it pushes back on attendance as well.
Attendance,
because the question is, if you do more in-class exercises, if you do reading in class, and students are not attending, you know, what is your scope to just say, well, you know, you haven't attended 25% of the class, you don't pass. Finished.
As long as it's in your course outline.
No, sure, but okay, beyond the, you know, the university. I mean, as a kind of collective practice around what we decide, and how pedagogically being in class matters more and more. That it's not just here are the readings, here's a question, go and do it on your own.
Sub-point to facilities management. That means we need a bigger class.
That's the logistics thing
class in the humanities building.
We can agree. But if there's only 350 seats in the lecture room and we've got 580 students, it means we're going to have to do 2 lectures for every lecture. So instead of 22 or 24, we're going to have to do 40.
Well, the people who admit students have to say we can only admit.
Well, there's the.
Yeah, we don't need to.
But can I just mention, I mean, none of these conversations can happen in a bubble. We need institutional support, and a lot needs to happen at admin and registration and thinking through the size of our. Actually, just what is the university? What is that space supposed to be?
So, Lloyd, you must invite Duresh, the new Vice Chancellor.
They are. It's the job.
Nice.
I also just think, and I know the High Degrees Research Committee is starting now, and Lindy's got ideas. We actually also really need to seriously think about postgraduate research. The epicenter of our thinking around this now has been at undergraduate level, which is understandable given the recency of the bots, you know.
But we thought postgraduates know better.
But what does this mean for the master's thesis and the PhD thesis? Right.
I often think what ties into a lot of it is
more of like a attitude problem, I think, coming into university where, I mean, it was touched on earlier where there's a large focus on marks, but I think a lot of students genuinely like, they don't care. And so the people not about marks, about learning. So those are the people like who will seek out those sort of tools. And it's very hard then because I don't think it's necessary. I mean, like AI has become a tool that they then use, but it's not, I don't think so much an issue with AI, rather I think it's an issue then with their own attitude. And I think that's another focus where like trying to mediate AI, like it says, like it's not going anywhere. And I think part of the problem that you need to address is the attitude towards learning that is fostered in the university context now.
We know that that is true. I think we're also struggling with how to foster appreciation for learning. I'd love to hear some of your ideas if you have any, but it is very tricky to actually change people's attitudes around that. But of course, that is very central to the problem.
But which is one of my motivations for some open writing, because it provides me a context for saying, this is my attitude, and I want you to try and develop it.
Just saying Neil's point behind you, I think is a good one.
Neil, on the postgraduate, many universities may not have had the defense are busy bringing the Bible in. What level? Even at MA level, as well as some structured presentations. That's interesting. I was wondering whether the Bible was going to come to the master's degree. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. More headaches for. Not yet. Anyone else on the line?
Authors also have their own limitations. Number of reasons. I don't know. I think it's assumed then, therefore, you know what I mean? Like, there are limitations to it as well.
Anyone online who wants to speak now, please just come in.
Hi.
Yes.
I've actually used that PDF. Sorry, it's Generali here. I've used the PDF generative AI, and I have to say I have found it a little bit useful in sorting out readings. The problem comes is when you start relying on the tools. So then again, it's the AI literature being taught, you know, what value these tools have and how to actually use them. But it has been really helpful in a lot of ways to generate, you know, keywords and even actually sort out current readings. So I've actually been finding that PDF one quite useful, to go back to Lennox's discussion on that. And just to go back to the whole point of, you know, these tools can be quite useful. It's again the attitude and the way you use it. And I can't remember who in the room mentioned the attitude of the students, but again, it's a tool that can be very helpful, but also very destructive. So I suppose it's just the way you are taught how to use it and having the literacy on it.
The smaller side, I actually did play around with 4.0. And you know, one thing I noticed is that it's supposedly very good in the mathematical sciences for logic. When I answer questions, it creates this very staccato bullet point type discourse. You know, so I think looking seriously at the differences between the humanities and the natural sciences, it's still not convinced. This thing is just, but yeah. Any more in the room? One more.
I just want to play devil's advocate a bit. Perhaps we can go back to oral assessment if we stop trying to just increase student volumes. Thank you. Maybe we can stop trying to get more students in class, fewer students, and then we can assess them in different ways.
Really complicated issue, that one.
Then how does that work in sense of people getting smart enough to get into university in a sense, like numbers wise? So do we mean that we stopped getting people into university? Does university become a niche now again? So what exactly.
Perhaps there should be more universities. Perhaps there should be more institutions doing the same.
But that's a long-term thing. That we need something that works now. That's universities take a long time to build, and all of that needs and a lot of money. So,
no.
I think the point is, it's unlikely that we're going to change the numbers, because I think it was also something that was said this morning. You know, that actually that's quite a large income stream for the university, if not the largest. So the idea is not to allow less students entry, but of course we do have to rethink how we assess and set it up so that's possible, including more oral presentation. But what Lloyd showed us this afternoon with ChatGPT going into PowerPoint is also very concerning.
In the story.
It's concerning. It's concerning in the sense that these big corporates are going to try and pump this out into every nook and cranny and create products all over the place. But I mean, if you look at anybody who see, I think anybody who's serious in any given domain, who looks at stuff in their domain generated by this stuff knows it's nonsense. Okay.
Yeah.
I think there's a generational problem here as well. You know, lots of people like me have spent 2/3 of their life before ChatGPT, and you have a certain embodied history of not having this tool. But we know other things. Internet's been around for a long time, and just the reason why I'm skeptical about a general approach to oral is because there's a fairly significant ontological point underpinning my type of linguistics, my kind of critical linguistics, particularly on the work of Roy Harris. And that's this notion of autoglottic inquiry. Okay, that writing, in a sense, is unsponsored. Okay, so in a sense, it's not that new. This ties in with heteroglossia, with this idea that writing is not like something. That's difficult. And autoglottic inquiry means that writing, in a sense, creates spaces as well. Think of all the disciplines and all the methods, ethnography. Okay. All the words ending with graphy that define spaces of specialism. Okay, so writing is quite profound. Yes, we can bring in a body, we can bring in dance, we can bring in speaking, and that these are other ways in which we express ourselves. But writing is quite profound. That's one of the things I wanted to bring up.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Thanks.